While many Canadians take justifiable pride in Canada's multicultural mosaic, it is important to acknowledge that racialized minorities, including Asian Canadians, suffer discrimination at the hands of the majority and demonstrated courage, wisdom, and perseverance in overcoming systemic racism.
It was clear from the beginning that Asians were not wanted in British Columbia, where most immigrants from Asia lived. The Provincial Elections Act of BC 1885 stated,
"No Chinaman, Japanese, or Indian shall have his name placed on the register of voters for any electoral district, or be entitled to vote at any election."
Essentially, this legal restriction prevented Asians from holding office and from entering mainstream professions such as law, pharmacy, engineering, accounting, and teaching. During the early 1900s, discrimination towards Chinese and Japanese became evident. In 1907, leaders of the Asiatic Exclusion League stirred up resentment towards Asians, resulting in a riot where hundreds of men looted and ravaged their way through Chinatown and Japantown, vandalizing businesses and causing extensive damage. By the time the mob reached Japantown, Japanese were ready for the attack and eventually forced the rioters to retreat. In spite of their courageous resistance, the result was that legislation was passed by the provincial government further discriminating against Asians.
To demonstrate loyalty, in spite of the fact that they were not treated as equal citizens, many Japanese Canadians volunteered to fight for Canada during the First World War. Despite the hardships and discrimination, Asians established their lives, raised families, and contributed to the province's economy. Discriminatory laws were invoked to prevent the entry of what Canada considered to be undesirable people. In 1908, the federal government passed the Continuous Passage Act, which stated that Indians would have to travel to Canada via a direct, non-stop passage from India. The Canadian government knew that this would be impossible because of the long distance from India. On May 23, 1914, 376 Indians, mostly Sikhs, along with some Muslims and Hindus, arrived in Vancouver and anchored near Burrard Inlet on the steamer ship Komagata-maru. The Canadian authorities would not allow the passengers to leave the boat, claiming the ship did not arrive via a direct passage and that most passengers did not have the $200 that would qualify them to enter British Columbia. For 2 months, the passengers, the Indian leaders in British Columbia, and the BC authorities were engaged in a legal battle. In the end, only 24 of the 376 passengers were given permission to legally stay in Canada. The rest were forced to leave and return home.
Some 6,500 Chinese workers were recruited by Canadian authorities to come to Canada to help build the Canadian Pacific Railway during the 1880s. Forced to leave their families behind, these Chinese laborers were often given the most difficult and dangerous jobs in cutting through mountainous regions of British Columbia to lay down rails for the iron horse that would eventually travel from coast to coast. Finally, in 1885, the railroad was completed and the cheap labor was no longer needed. In fact, Chinese workers received half the wages that white workers were paid. Due to the backlash towards the Chinese from union workers and from provincial politicians, the federal government passed the Chinese Immigration Act in 1885. This law imposed a head tax of $50 on Chinese immigrants in the hopes of discouraging them from entering Canada. However, this did not deter the Chinese from coming, and in 1900, the federal government increased the tax to $100. By 1903, it went up to $500, which was equivalent to 2 years of wages in Canada. The Canadian government collected $23 million from the Chinese through the head tax. However, at great cost to the Chinese families and communities, migrants from China continued to come to Canada. In 1923, Canada's Parliament passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. The result was that between 1923 and 1947, fewer than 50 Chinese immigrants came to Canada. In 1947, the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed.
Another outcome of this legislation and the head tax which preceded it for nearly 40 years was that many of the early Chinese could not bring their families, neither children nor even spouses, to Canada, thus creating a bachelor society in the Chinese-Canadian community. Many of the wives were left in China to raise their children by themselves, where they often experienced starvation and other extreme economic hardships. In order to survive, many Chinese immigrants opened laundry shops and restaurants that could be found in many communities across Canada. The first immigrant from Japan was Manzo Nagano, who landed in Victoria in 1877. The largest number of immigrants arriving in Canada from Japan immigrated during the period 1903 to 1908. Because provincial laws excluded them, as well as most Asian immigrants, from the professions such as medicine, law, and teaching, many Japanese had to establish themselves in resource industries such as fishing, lumbering, and market gardening. Due to their hard work, by the late 1930s, many immigrant Japanese families had become very successful. However, their success prompted further racism and reminders from politicians to Japanese immigrants that they were not wanted. This sentiment of ill will was best expressed in 1942 by Thomas Reed, a Liberal member of Parliament from BC, who said,
"Take them back to Japan. They do not belong here, and there is only one solution to the problem. They cannot be assimilated as Canadians, for no matter how long the Japanese remain in Canada, they will always be Japanese."
Shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, Canada declared war on Japan, and the lives of Japanese Canadians were placed in turmoil. Under government directives, the Japanese had to register as enemy aliens. They were placed under curfew and eventually removed from their homes and had their property confiscated. On February 24, 1942, an order-in council ordered the removal of all Japanese Canadians from a 100-mile-wide zone along the west coast. Many Japanese families were given only 24 hours to leave their homes. They were allowed to take up to 70 pounds of luggage and thus forced to leave behind priceless personal belongings.
Uprooted from their homes, thousands of Japanese Canadians were confined in livestock barns at Hastings Park in Vancouver's Pacific National Exhibition Grounds. Here, they were made to wait while the internment centers in the BC interior were made ready for them. The men were separated from their families and sent to road-building camps in interior British Columbia. Small towns such as New Denver, Caslow, and Slocan, as well as other more remote camps built for the internees, became crude living quarters, mainly for women, children, and the elderly. They lived in tiny, crowded shacks, each one shared by 2 families. Meanwhile, other Japanese Canadian families were offered a chance to remain together if they agreed to work on sugar beet farms in Alberta and Manitoba, where there were labor shortages. But all those who challenged the orders of the government to surrender their homes and properties were rounded up by the RCMP and incarcerated in barbed wire prisoner of war camps in northern Ontario.
Nearly 22,000 men, women, and children of Japanese ancestry were impacted. 75% of these residents were naturalized or Canadian-born citizens, but they were considered by the Government of Canada to be a threat to national security, simply because of their racial origin. As we have seen, this uprooting was not an isolated case of racism, but rather a culmination of discriminatory laws and attitudes directed towards the Japanese people since their arrival to Canada.
In May 1942, I moved with my grandparents to St. Agas, Manitoba, from Haney, British Columbia, to work as farm laborers on the sugar beet farm. 3 families lived in a 4-room shack without insulation, electricity, or water. The house had an open prairie, unprotected from the severe winter. The back-breaking work and long hours was extremely difficult to endure.
The result of decisions made by Canadians during the war meant that the once thriving Japanese-Canadian community on the West Coast was decimated. Towards the end of the war, Japanese Canadians were threatened with further expulsion. They were given the option for dispersal to places east of the Rockies or the option of outright repatriation to Japan. After much opposition from other Canadians concerned by this abuse of civil rights, a year later the government reluctantly rescinded the repatriation order, but by then some 4,000 Japanese Canadians, half of them born in Canada, had been exiled to Japan, where they were treated as aliens. It was not until April 1, 1949, that Japanese Canadians were given full citizenship rights, including the right to vote, and that they were permitted to return to the West Coast. In fact, Japanese Canadians had never posed a threat to national security during the war. The orders for the uprooting and internment actually went against the advice of the RCMP and military officials. On January 1, 1947, the Canadian Citizenship Act came into effect, defining who is a Canadian. Prior to this date, anyone born in Canada or who was a naturalized Canadian was considered a British subject rather than a Canadian citizen. The Canadian Citizenship Act also set up a process by which residents not born in Canada could acquire citizenship. Anyone born in Canada was now automatically a Canadian citizen. This allowed Asians who had been denied the right to vote, even though they had been born in Canada, the full rights of citizenship. The first person to receive Canadian citizenship was Prime Minister Mackenzie King on January 3, 1947. Shortly after, in May 1947, the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed, giving Chinese the right to immigrate.
My father was born in Canada and could not vote for most of his life. Finally, on December 3, 1948, he became a Canadian citizen. 1 generation later, I became a Canadian citizenship judge.
That I will be faithful. And that I will faithfully observe.
On September 22, 1988, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney officially apologized to Japanese Canadians for their internment during the Second World War and said that his government was putting things right with the measures including compensation to individuals, a community fund, and the establishment of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. The acknowledgement and compensation had a profound effect on the victims of the internment and lifted the guilt that they had carried for over 40 years, thinking that they had done something wrong.
Nearly 20 years later, on June 22, 2006, Prime Minister Stephen Harper gave a formal apology in the House of Commons for the imposition of the head tax on Chinese Canadians and for the Chinese Exclusion Act. His government also approved a compensation package for the victims and spouses of the tax and established a fund for community projects.
Most recently, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau formally apologized on May 18, 2016, in the House of Commons for the Komagata Maru incident in 1914, in which hundreds of Sikh, Muslim, and Hindu passengers were denied entry to Canada and forced to return to an uncertain and ultimately violent fate in India. Opposition leaders added their support to the apology. Canadian society has clearly benefited from the contributions of Asian immigrants and their descendants throughout our history. Many Asian Canadians have achieved national and worldwide recognition for their achievements.
The recognition of the injustices perpetrated upon Asian communities in Canada is a tremendous step forward in ensuring that rights and freedoms for all Canadians will be protected for future generations.
We have much to learn from the lessons of past injustices and from present challenges, as we strive to unleash all the potential found in our rich and diverse cultural makeup.